Welcome to the American Library in Paris. Welcome to Evenings with an Author. I'm Rachel Donadio, the curator of cultural programs here at the library. We have been in operation for more than 100 years, and we're the largest English language lending library on the continent. We have the pleasure of hosting many writers, artists, journalists, and academics, and we are continuing this legacy tonight. We're very pleased to be working in partnership with the Overseas Press Club to bring you this panel on populism, this hybrid panel. A couple of notes: after about 60 minutes, we're going to open up the conversation to questions from our in-person audience, and then if we have time, we'll go to our Zoom audience. This evening's speakers are Gelin, who is a longtime award-winning journalist on the U.S. far right and the author of 8 books on American politics, including the forthcoming The White Storm: How Racism Poisoned American Democracy. He writes for The Guardian, The Washington Post, and other publications. He moved to Paris in August. Here, welcome, Martin.
Thank you.
And here on the screen, we have Elisabeth joining us remotely. We have Elisabeth Zerofsky, who is a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine and has written extensively on the rise of right-wing populism in Europe and the U.S., from France, Germany, Poland, Hungary, Italy, and the U.S. She is currently working on a book on this topic for Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. She lives in Berlin, and here she will be joining us by Zoom. And joining us shortly, he is on his way. News often means that journalists are running late. Thierry Arnaud is international editor for France's BFM TV. He joined BFM TV in 2006 as its US correspondent and served as the network political editor for 6 years. Thierry began his career in print journalism and was based for several of those years in London and New York. And last but not least, our Overseas Press Club organizer of this conference, Vivienne Walt, who is Paris correspondent for Time magazine and Fortune magazine, and has covered French right-wing politics, including Time profiles on Jordan Bardella and Marine Le Pen. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, Business Week, and more. She is governor of the Overseas Press Club of America. Please help me in welcoming them with a big round of applause.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. And thank you. Oh, where's Elisabeth? Did she disappear? Anyway, happy to see you all here on a Wednesday night. And I just wanted to start off by saying a couple of introductory remarks, and then I'll kind of get out the way of these fantastic colleagues of mine. I think it's safe to say we're in a bit of a perilous moment politically. You can just ask the US Secret Service about that these days. And we have this tendency a little bit sitting here in Paris to feel quite smug about ourselves, thinking, thank God we're not in the US. It's such a nightmare there. And indeed, it's been pretty fraught for the last several years. But I think that we need to dig a little deeper and find the echoes across the Atlantic in what's going on politically on both sides of the Atlantic. And yes, we don't have a major dominant populist figure in Europe at the moment that's truly disruptive, but that doesn't mean it won't happen or that it won't happen soon. Given what's happening across Europe. The other thing is, of course, when we talk about populism, I think a lot of us immediately think far right, that this is basically hardcore anti-immigrant and so on. And I think a lot of what we'll hear tonight will be that, but it's not necessarily always that. And happy to have some challenging questions on that from the audience. There are certain, writers and journalists that are grappling with all of these terms and wondering if we ought to kind of retire these terms like right-wing, left-wing. We we're grappling with a whole lot of forces, actually, for which the terminology is still in flux and still essentially being fought out, I suppose. When I was preparing for this panel, I just went back into my own reporting and picked out some phrases and some quotes that had really stuck in my mind over the years. I do remember interviewing Steve Bannon in Brussels once, and he said how the centrist parties in Europe were over. And he said they do not have the youth, they do not have the ideas, they do not have the vigor. And right around that time, I also had interviewed one of Viktor Orban's key advisors, his foreign minister, Peter Shirato, who said, the issue of migration is a game changer. It is the root cause for many of the political conflicts in Europe. So both of those things really stuck in my mind as I came to think about this evening. And I want to start off with you, Elisabeth, because you've been looking at Europe's rising populist politicians and how essentially they appear to be echoing some of what's going on in the US.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for having me. I'm glad to be joining you from Berlin tonight. And I think there's certainly echoing things from the United States, that's for sure. The way I see it, I think that there are certain kinds of structural, economic, cultural changes, especially that have been happening across Europe and in the US in the last 30, 40 plus years, which have created a political space for populists to thrive. But in some ways, we might think that perhaps Trump has been most successful at doing that. And so certainly populist party leaders in Europe are mimicking him, both literally. You have, every version of Make America Great now exists, Make Italy Great, Make France Great, Make France Great Again, that kind of thing. And just in the way that, especially that these parties and the leaders and the politicians in these parties make use of, I would say, manipulate social media and media space and rhetoric and all those kinds of things to appeal to voters and to bring them in and to keep them there. So yes, certainly there's a lot of mimicry happening, and I report from across Europe, but in Germany as well, and that is kind of astonishing to see because I think, for the last number of years, we always said, okay, Germany is kind of an exception to the right-wing populist wave that's happening because of German history. But I have been, for the book that I'm working on, I've been reporting, I've been going to some Alternative for Germany events in the last couple of weeks. They have an election coming up this weekend, and it's very, as Steve Bannon would have said, it's very vigorous, it's very raucous, it's the kind of politics that, I think a lot of people didn't expect to see in Germany at this time.
As I understand it, a lot of what has happened in Germany has sort of been rooted a little bit in what we call in Europe the migrant crisis, huge influx of migrants across the Mediterranean and across and from the east around 2015, in which the former German Chancellor made a gesture to welcome in 1 million immigrants. Now, I want to turn to you, Martin, because this whole issue of immigration has become, as the Hungarian foreign minister told me in my interview with him, the root cause, as he put it, of much of what's happening politically across Europe, and certainly it has become the major rallying cry among Trump supporters in the US. What is going on here? Because certainly in Europe you have effectively a population crisis. and immigrants were desperately needed for many sectors of the economy. Little less so, obviously, in the US, but nonetheless, you have this rallying cry in parts of America where you do not have necessarily huge immigrant populations. So what do you think is behind this, and how much is real? How much is simply a kind of otherism, as they say?
Right. I mean, yeah. I think it's really fundamental to understand the rise of right-wing nationalism and populism. I wrote a book in 2012 about the conservative movement in America, and spent 2 years traveling around the most conservative parts of the country during the Tea Party movement, if anybody remembers those guys. I have probably talked to around 500 Trump voters and sort of nationalist Republicans over the past decade, and probably 495 have mentioned immigration and their opposition to it. So it's definitely the number one issue for Trump voters and for whatever preceded that in the Republican Party. And I mean, America, more than most European nations, define itself as a nation of immigrants, and there's this vision of a pluralist democracy, right, which is also challenged by this new movement, which has appeared every time that there has been drastic increases in immigration. Like in the 1920s, for example, you saw a very similar xenophobic backlash, and in 1924 they passed this very, very restrictive immigration act. And I think what we're seeing right now is very similar to that, where there's a lot of demographic fears in America. There's a lot of white conservative Americans, particularly in rural America, in small towns, in ex-urban America, that are aware of this statistics of in sometime in the 2040s, the white Americans are expected to be a minority for the first time, and that is
which year is?
I mean, it keeps shifting demographic projections, but I think it's usually around 2045 that this is supposed to happen. And I mean, California, it happened in 1980. In Texas, I think it happened a couple of years ago. So, like, a lot of states have already seen this demographic shift. And California has. When it happened in California in the 80s, there was also a very similar xenophobic backlash and all these fears that, like, what will happen to our culture? White conservatives said that. And California is now the 5th biggest economy in the world, bigger than France's economy as far as GDP. And there's obviously not a perfect place, but it also hasn't been a civilizational collapse as a lot of xenophobic politicians predicted at the time. So but I think there's a very clear pattern that whenever there is a drastic demographic shift, you see this kind of backlash, and it's also exploited by conservatives who maybe don't really care that much about immigration, but can use it to win elections and pass other forms of legislation.
So, Elisabeth, I'm going to bring you back in here. What has happened in Germany? We're nearly 10 years past the migrant crisis, the height of the migrant crisis, and that enormous influx into Germany. Have people come to regard it as a positive, or was this, in fact, the beginning of a wave of anti-immigrant sentiment in the country?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. Of course, it depends who you ask. I think there is a lot of, it's silly to there has been a big backlash against it. It would be silly to, to suggest that there hasn't. I think what Martin was saying about, about a sort of fear of xenophobic fear of demographic change, I think that's certainly, that's absolutely a big part of it. I think, yeah, I mean, I think also there have been, as in the US, there have been a number of, there have been some crimes, of course, that have been linked to migration, to people who were perhaps who'd come into the country and who had, in several cases, had applied for a permit to stay or for asylum, that kind of thing, and had been rejected, and so weren't supposed to be in the country and committed a crime. And so these cases are obviously, statistically, they're rare, they're small, but they've been, of course, publicized immensely. And so, if it can sometimes give a, disproportionate sense of the impact of these crimes, but it's, it's a similar thing that's happening in the States. So yeah, I think that is, there absolutely has been a backlash to it. I think, it also gets a little bit more complicated in the parts of Germany where the far right party is Alternative for Germany, which is abbreviated as the AfD. So in the parts of Germany where the AfD is strongest, in former East Germany, is absolutely not where the greatest sort of immigrant populations or populations of migrants or refugees who have settled is not that in that part of the country. And so, not to say, of course, there's an element of perception there. There's an element of, okay, these things are happening in other parts of my country and that's upsetting to me. And I don't, or it's also sort of a xenophobic reaction. Of course, I don't want it to come here. So there's an element of that. But, at the same time, I will say I went to an event last Saturday that was like a citizens dialogue with a woman who is running to be a local representative for the AfD in a town just outside of Berlin. And it was very interesting to listen to her because essentially her response to everything, to every political problem, to every question that was brought up was immigration. So, the housing prices are too high. And there's not enough housing. There's a housing crisis. That's because of immigration, because, they're taking up our housing, or, the government is spending money on them and not on us. The schools are falling behind. Oh, that's because of immigration, because we have, people who don't speak German who are in schools. And so that's, and so it was very interesting to watch, to listen to her. Interesting. But it was a very, it was a very essentially simplistic, easy worldview to sell to her audience that, immigration is the explanation for all of our problems. And of course, certainly in that part of Germany, that's just not, it's just not the case. So I think what Martin was saying about this issue being used by politicians to gain power in the way that politicians always do is obviously part of it. And then I think, there's an element of, I think a big part of right-wing populism and left-wing populism as well is just, of course, this kind of, elites, people in positions of power and positions of institutional power have done us wrong, and all the decisions that they've made are bad, and they have, set us on the wrong path, and they have done all this sort of corrupt things with power, and therefore everything they've done is terrible. And so I think there's this sense that, with this sort of populist, psychodrama in a way of frustration and anger and disappointment and resentment and that sort of thing. There's a tendency to see decisions that were made by people in power as wrong, bad, terrible. And of course, Angela Merkel, when she decided to open the borders in 2015, she was the leader of the Conservative Party, of the Christian Democratic Union. And that position that she took was significantly more to the left than what her party historically had done. And so I think, certain people on the right saw the sort of traditional conservative party joining with the traditional liberal party and feeling like, okay, there's just this one sort of elite consensus in the center, and it's become something that I don't believe in anymore. And I have nowhere to go, and so I'm going to turn to the far right, because they're the only ones who are saying what I want to hear, essentially.
Firstly, hi, Thierry, Arnaud. Great that you
Hi.
could get out of the newsroom. Woo!
Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't know if you're grounded enough now to be able to speak, but I want to throw it open to you, because Elisabeth mentioned something really crucial, and that is the anti-elitism fervor, really, that has grown, some of which, it seems to me, from living in France, is entirely justified. But we've been through years of this in France that seems to be ramping up more and more, and it isn't necessarily right-wing, left-wing. It's both, really. They meet in the middle on this question. This is a kind of movement, if you think about the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, the pension protests, more recently the farmers' protests. They are a number of people, and we can call them a kind of populist movement, that have really revolted against the sense that there is an elite that's kind of untouchable, that's running everything. Is that a good way to describe what's going on in France?
Yes, I agree. Good evening, everyone, and apologies for showing up late. By way of a disclaimer, I'm a reporter, so the way I look at this issue is the same way I look at every issue. In other words, I'm not an academic who conducted extensive studies on the subject. I ask questions, I go places, and I try to understand what's going on. Sometimes I get it wrong. By way of an anecdote, we had a poll at BFM TV before the last election, and the purpose of the poll was to try and figure out, to guess which parties would get how many seats. My bet was that the Rassemblement National, the far right, would get an outright majority, which brings us to...
You weren't alone in thinking that.
Yes, which brings us to our discussion tonight. I guess in a very deep way, all of what you are describing is a reflection of people feeling that they're being ignored, they're being despised, they're being forgotten, and they need to be seen. On a very basic level, when you look at the yellow vest movement, why do people wear a yellow vest when they're on the side of the road? Because they're in trouble and because they want to be seen. And I think that was really an appropriate symbol for what they were trying to achieve. An anecdote that springs to mind is, so I went to the US to cover both conventions. And as I was leaving Chicago, the Democratic Convention, I was leaving my hotel room, and the cleaning lady comes into my room, and my credentials and stuff were lying around, so we start discussing what had happened in the convention. And she was a really nice lady, and we chatted for a little bit. She was an African-American lady, probably in her 60s. And so I asked her, who are you going to vote for? And she says, I think Harris. But it was not, an enthusiastic response. And she said, they're not doing anything for people like us. And many people are for Trump. So many people in her, extended, family and colleagues and whatever. So it was interesting to me that she felt like she was part of this ever larger group of people that feels neglected and forgotten.
It's very hard to imagine, how we tackle this issue effectively. In the sense that, we're living through an era where you have this enormous ballooning of wealth in some ways, and, in the hands of, relatively small number of people, and but it's very visible number of people, and our newspapers and TV are just, filled with, you know, the tales of these almost mythic, you know, multi-billionaires who are now running our lives because their apps are on our phone and they're creating AI and they're doing this and that. And for the regular folks who don't have access to that, it appears to be a real sense of kind of resentment. I just want to get back to you, Martin, and your reporting in the US as well. Is there a sense that this is a phase we're living through that will pass, and that, in a sense, we will kind of swing back to this kind of more moderate, kind of bipartisan way of dealing with the world? Or are we really at a kind of pivot point in your mind?
Right. I mean, I think predictions are always perilous in America. Nobody expected George W. Bush to become president. Nobody expected Obama to become president. Nobody expected Trump to become president. It's both a source of optimism and pessimism for me when I think about America, that it's impossible to predict the future. It's a much less stable and predictable direction in politics there than in most European countries. But I think we can be pretty sure that the forces that are driving Trumpism, if we just boil it down to anti-immigration and anti-elitism, that will be sustained long after Trump is gone. Because I think it's always been there in American history. And the book that I have written that is coming out next year is about this dynamic, how every time there has been demographic shifts, every time there has been progress for African Americans, for ethnic minorities, it has been met with a fierce backlash that takes two parts. One part is violent extremism, you know, from the Ku Klux Klan to what we saw in January 2021, right, the storming of the Capitol. But the other form is a flight from the commons and a kind of reluctance to participate in the systems that create a solid welfare state of the kind that we have in almost every European country. And I think that's a crucial key to understand American history, that especially since the 60s and the progress of the civil rights movement, you've seen this. There's an economist in America called Heather McGhee who writes eloquently about what she calls drain the pool politics. And this comes from when they desegregated the swimming pools in the American South, instead of letting the pools be used by everybody, a lot of white affluent communities just filled them with cement and turned them into parking lots or built private country clubs. So instead of sharing the commons with everybody in this diverse country, conservative white Americans have often sealed off their own space and prefer to not participate in the common project of America. And I think that's relevant to understand Trumpism and the lack of welfare state in America, but also what is happening right now, where the kind of ultimate conclusion of that is an attack on democracy itself. The storming of the Capitol was, I think, the evolution of that idea that, you know, as American democracy becomes more diverse, as the American voters become more diverse, conservative white Americans are more reluctant to want to be a part of it. I think the most interesting speech, maybe you saw it at the DNC, was not one of the most viral moments, but Raphael Warnock, the senator from Georgia, who spoke exactly about this. He spoke about how the storming of the Capitol was a revolt against pluralist democracy, a revolt against African American agency. and the idea that this country that is slowly becoming minority majority, where voters are now not just white voters are allowed to pick presidents. That was the core of the protest, the storming of the Capitol.
I just want to make one remark, and that is like when I hear Thierry and you speak about your observations about the US politics and what it says about European politics, the one thing that does strike me and has always struck me in France and in Europe is the lack of participation in politics at a high level by immigrant populations, particularly of color. I mean, you turn on, American television, and just about every mayor of every, major city in America is now black. And you simply don't find that here. So it seems to me in my head, and maybe Elisabeth, you can join in here too, that one thing that would be a kind of counterweight to this popular movement is if there was this kind of political voice, visible public political voice among people of color in Europe.
I agree completely, but it's difficult because it's a matter of finding these people and helping them emerge. And just to give you a concrete example, which is not that of a politician, but for about 3 years I was running a sister network to BFM TV, a network that's called BFM Business, which is a kind of a CNBC in France. And one of the issues I had was all the faces on the screen were white, and I thought that was not a reflection of what France was and should be seen as. So I took it upon myself to make a difference in that respect and try to hire, faces of diversity. But I struggled because I just couldn't find the right people to put in front of the screen and in the seats who, had the experience of reporters who had, were able to do what I needed. So it's a complex equation that starts with schools, that starts with training, and that starts with some sort of positive discrimination as well. But it's a combination of all of that. It starts earlier than just finding a guy who's smart and who's going to emerge and become a minister, and that you're going to name into a government and just to show that France has many different faces. It starts early, and that's something that we have not been good at.
Elisabeth, I don't know if you want to join in here.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with that. I have done some reporting about young politicians in particular in some of the Paris banlieues. And, there are some very talented, very smart, very thoughtful local leaders and thinkers and writers. But, and I'm not saying this is just France either. I think I'm sure it's similar in Germany and other parts of Europe, that, I did a story about one young gentleman in particular who, who should have gone to Sciences Po, but he didn't know about it, and he didn't, have the preparation to go there, and he didn't have the correct information, and he didn't know about the acceptance process and all that sort of thing. And so, as far as I understand it, and it's this way everywhere, right? There are channels, or there are streams, there are ways that that people get into these networks and into these professions and into these positions of essentially institutional, visibility and power, and that those channels remain. I think this is maybe what Thierry was saying as well, that those channels remain, sort of, I don't want to say inaccessible, but but difficult for various reasons that have to do, with both class and race and cultural discrimination and that sort of thing. With in many parts of Europe, as far as I understand, in Germany, I would say that's the case as well.
We have, without remaining 15 minutes, say that we're talking among ourselves before we open up to questions. I wanted to get from each of you a sense of what you think is ahead. Starting with you, Thierry. We're 2 years away from, actually not less than 2 years away. No, sorry, 2.5 years away from the presidential election in France. One in which, Marine Le Pen has made it completely clear she intends to win this time around. Firstly, are we headed that way? And if so, is it really a different France? Or are these populist, as you put it, far-right parties, are they basically mainstreamed at this point? Is it really going to be a different kind of France or not?
Well, there's a two-part answer. I think to some extent you can see that the populists are, before winning elections, as far as France is concerned, they're winning the argument in several places in Europe. When you see Scholz is closing the borders in Germany, Keir Starmer is going to Italy and praising Italy's immigration policies and says he's going to use this as a model. The mayor of Nice, Christian Estrosi, goes on TV today and says he wants to close the border with Italy. So in that sense, they are winning the argument. Listen to what Kamala Harris says about immigration and borders and everything. She's gone a long way towards what the Republicans and Trump are saying. The other part of the answer is this. Marine Le Pen's party is about 3 million votes in 2017's parliamentary elections, 4.2 million in 2022, 11 million in 2024. So I guess that tells you which way things are headed. And of course, a lot is going to depend on what's happening in terms of the mess we're in now, the ability of Michel Barnier to form a credible government, the ability of this government to succeed. But I think the way out of this is twofold. The first thing is populism has to be seen to fail. It comes to a point where the only way out is, to see them fail. And when that happens, what's the alternative? You could argue to some extent that Labour winning the election in the UK is Boris Johnson's brand of conservatism failing. You could make the case that Donald Tusk winning the election in Poland is a result of the populist government that was before him failing. So maybe we'll have to come to that in France as well.
So we
I know
get
it's a very, you might not consider that.
so we get 5 or 10 years of Le Pen government, and then France will be in a terrible shape.
Yeah, but I agree with Martin's point, which was very important. I think those issues, those underlying issues, have to be dealt with. And the reason why these people are succeeding today is because the guys who came before them completely failed them.
Well, although I have to say, okay, here we go, Martin. This is a question for you. Thierry says you got to basically, fall on your face, totally fail, and then we'll get a new kind of politics. However, many would say Trump did exactly that, which is why he lost the election in 2020.
He lost, but he got 11 to 12 million more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016. And it's important to keep that in mind as well.
True. Okay. Maybe you are right. So let me ask it a different way, Martin. At what point, I've read this phrase about 3 or 4 times in the US press over the last few weeks. whether or not the Trump fever will break. What's going to make this Trump fever break in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, Obama famously said in 2012 when he ran for re-election that if I win this election, I believe that the Republican fever will break, which was at that time, the Tea Party and all the emerging kind of right-wing populism. And instead we saw the opposite of that, and we've seen the opposite every election, regardless whether they have won or lost. And I think nationalism will stay resilient, but I think what's kind of sometimes forgotten is that so will the unified opposition to it. And you're right that Trump got more votes in 2020 than 2016, but Joe Biden got, I think, 12 million more votes than Barack Obama did. And not because Joe Biden is more charismatic and energized the more vibrant political movement than Obama did, but because people were really, really against Trump. And I think we saw the same thing in France this summer when everybody predicted a victory for Bardella, and instead we saw this very broad coalition emerging. Right, the Republican front worked again, and I think that's a kind of untapped energy and strength in society today that nobody is really speaking to, but someone could emerge and harness this. Like Habermas, the philosopher, has a beautiful phrase called constitutional patriotism, and I think that's what we saw in France in this summer, and I think it's what we saw in America in 2020. I think we saw some glimpses of it in the EU election in the Scandinavian countries, where everybody was also expecting a surge for the far right, but we saw instead of retreat, a pretty significant retreat for far right parties. They were seen as having gone too far. They were harassing, the free press. They were questioning the judiciary. They were doing all kinds of things that just were seen as attacks on the core of democracy. And I think there is a lot of anti-immigration sentiments. There is a lot of anti-elitism sentiments, but there is also a lot of people who understand how fragile and precious democracy is, and really get upset when you see politicians that start challenging human rights, start challenging the free press, start challenging civil society the way Hungary is doing. Yeah, I think that's the kind of untapped political force today that we just need. We need charismatic leaders to kind of mobilize those forces as well.
Thierry?
The key issue to me, as far as Trump is concerned, in this election is the economy. It's very simplistic, but my experience is you get two kinds of Trump voters. You get the MAGA fans, and these, are going to be in his camp no matter what happens. And you got people, and I've heard this many times, telling you, I don't particularly like the guy, but I'm not choosing a friend. I'm not choosing somebody I'm going to invite to my son's wedding. What I have in front of me is 4 years of Donald Trump as president, and now 3.5 years of Joe Biden as president. And my experience is that I was better off under Donald Trump. And for that reason, I might vote for him, even though I don't like him. And in my opinion, in the key counties in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, this is what is going to make the difference. It's those people who look at this in a more rational way, guided primarily by their self-interest, and consider that they were better off when he was president.
Elisabeth, I don't know if you want to add something from Germany, where, of course, there is a bit of an economic downturn. You have, we never thought we'd see Volkswagen talking about closing factories. So how does it fit into the populist wave, and what do you see ahead?
I mean, yes, that's true of Germany. What I have to say about it isn't necessarily particular to Germany. Building on what both Martin and Thierry have said, I certainly agree with them. I think in terms of this sort of the issues underlying Trumpism and underlying far-right populism, having to do with immigration, having to do with demographic change, having to do with anti-elitism, that sort of thing. Of course, even if you get those oppositional forces together and they can get an electoral majority and they can win elections, that doesn't make these other sort of these other forces go away. And so I think, I was actually discussing this with a friend of mine who's a historian of Russia, actually, and Russia is, of course, an interesting kind of parallel to hold up to ourselves, but the sort of mutual demonization of both sides in the US and in other places is very antithetical to democracy. Democracy is about, respecting and listening and disagreeing, certainly. Of course, there are certain things that are coming up in politics these days that are beyond the pale, and we have to label them as such, and we have to keep them there. But I think that what has happened in the States and other places where each side does not accept the other side in their political choices and in the outcomes of elections just leaves you at an impasse, right? And so there has to be, in some way, a way to bring people into back into a more consensual society. Of course, there are always extremes, and there are certain ideas and voters and things like that that will never be part of that. But for the most part, that this kind of each side casting each other as antithetical to democracy, or as demonizing the other side, and is that we should be trying to figure out ways to bring the tone down and to allow people to listen to each other and to be able to work together.
I think at this point we would like to open it up to questions. Let's see, Emma or Rachel, or should I just pick out people? Since I think there might be quite a few questions, I think maybe we should take 1, 2, 3, and then answer those 3. And then we'll go on to the next. 1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, good evening. Thank you all for your insights. I was rather surprised to hear sort of these legitimate concerns from populist voters about the economy, about immigration, and nothing at all about fake news and election meddling and how this is actually whipping up a lot of this polarization. So I'd be interested to hear you speak to that. Thank you.
Well, I want to echo that very much indeed. I appreciate the conversation too. I appreciate the points made at the end about the skepticism that we ought to have regarding the success of populism. Trump lost in 2020. The red wave did not happen in 2022, and so on and so forth. A fair degree, not to be Pollyannish about it, but I think the question raised about misinformation and fake news points to the component in our political world today that really must be confronted, which is social media. And, that amplifies all of this tremendously and may in fact be amplifying it to the point of distortion. And I'd love to hear what you think about the ways that social media is impacting how people campaign, how you cover these points, because it's almost like you're covering tweets, which doesn't seem to me to really make a lot of sense.
I'm going to preface what I say by saying I'm not entirely sure I agree with the thesis behind the question I'm about to pose, but you all have very eloquently and adequately, I think, underscored the resentment towards elites and in terms of this populist dilemma, both from the left and the right. I'm also wondering to what extent you take into account the growing, in fact, probably irreparable lack of confidence in institutions that undergird the various societies, democratic societies in which we live. This is certainly paramount in the United States, where, given everything that's happened with the Supreme Court, a lot of people on the left, well, certainly on the left, no longer believe that there is a guardian behind the political powers that play. Here in Europe, there's a growing dissatisfaction and unhappiness with Europe as an institution. And I think across the various countries in Europe, one of the reasons why you have the populist waves that you do is that people don't believe that the governments can deliver what the people expect them to deliver every time they put somebody new into office. So the question that I have is, do you accept, perhaps, that as this pressure builds and leads potentially to explosion, that maybe we should begin to accept that explosion and demolition of the current order and a restructuring, a something beyond simply, can we talk to each other, more civilly, is necessary. Because as I see it, all we're really doing, and this is especially the case in the United States, is kicking the can down the road, hoping that things will eventually get better, only to see them getting worse.
Well, there's a lot to chew on. Who would like to tackle the whole issue of social media, which, of course, in some ways post-dated the beginning of this big wave of populism? I think we can only really talk about it in the last, 8 years ago, I guess. How has it changed things? And are we, as I understood the gentleman at the back on the left here, say, in effect, we, the media, are a little bit guilty of latching onto social media, creating it as our kind of, repertorial kind of foundation a little bit. How does that fit into election meddling? And what do we do about it? Martin?
Sure. I covered Silicon Valley for many years, and I, 2014 to 17, spent a lot of time harassing Silicon Valley executives about the way that I thought that they were irresponsibly handling the ecosystem of news. And this was a very sort of unpopular angle before 2016, right, when Brexit happened and Trump happened, and then all of a sudden there was a global tech clash, and everybody was asking these questions. And I think it's an absolutely crucial part of it. So thanks for bringing this up. There's a lot of aspects of nationalism and far-right populism that we haven't covered tonight, but I think that's an absolutely crucial one. And if you just look at America, there is about 70-80% of Trump voters have views on the facts of the state of America that are just factually wrong. They think that unemployment is at record highs. They think the stock market has fallen since Biden became president, even though it just keeps breaking records. They think that inflation is the worst in the world, even though it's lower than in most rich countries, and so on and so on. They think crime has gone up every year. You ask a Republican, they think that crime was worse than the last year, even though it's at relatively record low numbers in most urban areas in America. And social media is the obvious explanation for this, but not only social media. Also, I think dishonest, broadcast media and legacy media, and also the way I think serious news outlets report on these issues, as someone suggested? Like should we report on every tweet that a controversial person sends out? I think there was a study from the Reuters Institute last year that showed that the biggest problem with disinformation in Western democracies is not like troll farms on social media or like Russian bots. It's what they call elites who lie. So it's people like Donald Trump, people like Elon Musk, who just make things up, and then it's amplified everywhere on social platforms and also in legacy media, right? So a lot of an easy sort of solution for that, not a complete solution, but it's just if I've seen a lot more of this in the past few years. If there is an obvious lie, if Trump makes an erroneous statement, if he makes something up about a certain group of migrants, put it in the headline that this is not accurate, instead of just broadcasting the headline and making another 10 million people see the lie. So there are mechanisms to break this down, and there are obviously some successful regulations happening in Europe as far as social media platforms. So I think, but they're mostly still based in Silicon Valley or in China, and I don't see much hope that America or China will take more responsibility for this platform. So I think that problem will persist, but we can make it a little bit less worse, I think, by making responsible choices as editors and writers.
I think we're going to take the next 3 questions.
I would add something.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I would just add something very quickly to that. I actually think that these questions that they go together, the lack of confidence in institutions and fake news and election meddling, that goes together, right? Because essentially the media is an institution. It's come to be seen as an elite institution, fair or not, we can debate that. And so that is why, people have to be primed to believe fake news. I, as a journalist for the New York Times, I can go out and I can argue with somebody and I can tell them again and again and again that, history happened this way and not that way, but they're not going to, if somebody, many people are not going to believe a word that I say, and they're going to turn to Tucker Carlson on Twitter, who is platforming, historians who are completely inverting everything about the 20th century. So I would tie the fake news and misinformation problem to the institutional problem that whoever asked that question, who I unfortunately can't see, is exactly right about. In terms of institutional, so then we get to the question of institutional reform. What do we do to that? Do we allow the pressure to build until explode? I mean, I, of course, would be very wary of that, because then you get a situation, for example, if Trump wins wins the US election, he will be able to reform those institutions in a way that, as we're aware of with Project 2025 and that sort of thing, which will gut those institutions, or which will potentially put the US in a situation that might look something like Hungary, where you have just total institutional capture by one individual. That's what I would potentially foresee happening. So, of course, we want to think about institutional reform, but in the United States, that's very complicated with 50 states and 50 state governments and constitutional amendments. How do you reform the Supreme Court? That's a mess that potentially, a President Harris would inherit, that I think Joe Biden has also tried to tackle, but not with so much success, because he's been blocked by Republicans. But that's my 2 cents.
Thierry.
Yes, I wanted to make 2 points briefly. I think democracy works if we have differences of opinions, but not differences of facts. And I think social media is massively contributed to the fact that now we disagree on facts. And that's a very deep problem, in my opinion. Point number 2 is there's been a couple of mentions of Brexit, which I think is, to me, really captures everything we've been talking about tonight. Brexit, I mean, the referendum and the majority for Brexit was largely based on lies, on what would happen if, Britain exited the European Union. The most obvious being this red bus, with I don't know how many billions of pounds written on them, all the money that would go back to the health system, because it was wasted by being given away to Brussels. And of course, that never happened. That's one in several lies. But and since then, I think factually you can make the case that Brexit has failed in many ways. It has also contributed to fracturing Britain in many ways, between young and old, between England and other places, between London and and more rural parts of England. So it has a very, very deep impact. But I think at the basis of the referendum was something that is very important, is that the British people were trying to send the message that they wanted to be able to decide to vote for and potentially to fire people who would make decisions for them. And I think one of the big issue, and that brings me to what you were talking about with respect to Europe, I think the big issue with the way Europe is working today is that you don't get that sense. You get that sense that these people decide, and then there's nothing you can do about what they decide. And there's no way you can kick them out if you feel they screwed up. And I think that is, if you want the European idea and the European ideal to continue to prosper, you have to find an answer to this.
Do we have another 3 questions? 1. Any more hands in the room? 2 and 3. 1, 2, and 3.
Hi, I'm a Californian, and I'm going back before the elections to vote in California, which is basically meaningless because we're a blue, blue, blue state, as you all know. My concern is, and I don't know, we have not seen it in Europe, my concern is the day after the election, is that Trump is already building up that it is going to be stolen, and he is already saying it's going to be stolen. And, you know, you mentioned the failure of the institutions, and you look at what's happened in the Supreme Court in the last year, and how they have given him a strong benefit of the doubt. So it's a very frightening period from that respect. I don't think it's possible, as we've seen in prior presidential elections, to have a 6, 8, 10-point, power or difference between votes. I think it's going to be margins. I think it's going to be 2-3%, and it will give and fuel, Trump to go full bore at, going into legal arguments across in each of the states. They are now so polluted. Who knows how many electioneers? And so I wonder how you all see, why has that not happened in Europe, the contentions of the electorate and the votes, and the troubling thing that's going to happen in America?
Number 2 hand was here. Sorry. Nope. Here. Nope. No, on the other side. Oh, okay. All right. We're running out of time.
My question is in a different tack, which is, we haven't talked much about left-wing populism and the strains of that populism, which we see in France, which is also often anti-immigrant. And I don't know if anyone could add something about that.
I'm afraid that is the last question. Do we have time for a quick response? Certainly your remark about the stop the steal, that's likely to happen if Kamala Harris wins the election, almost certainly will happen, goes back to what Thierry was saying about there being no consensus over facts. And facts essentially is what underlines our ability to function in a democracy. And in terms of the second question, does anyone want to tackle that?
No, I agree. First, I think you can drop the almost in your almost certainly will happen, because it's going to be one of two things. Either Trump wins or he will say that, everybody else cheated. So that's what's going to happen. There is left-wing populism, absolutely. It's not as strong, but it exists. In somebody like Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, for example, who is capitalizing on this. And of course, when you look at the two, the two brands of populism, they're both doing ever better.
I think we are out of time, folks. And I'm sure that there's a lot more questions